Well, we still don't have another round of stimulus. Congress is still stuck on supposedly negotiating, but the Federal Reserve has taken some matters into its own hands, offering interest-free loans to some corporations while simultaneously offering up loans with interest and a shorter period of time for states and cities to pay those loans back compared to what they're offering to corporations. So this is a great piece that was written by a publication founded by David Sirota, the Daily Poster. Matthew Cunningham Cook writes about how Chevron, for instance, was able to borrow money at half the rate as Wisconsin, meaning the oil giant was effectively getting a government subsidy while state taxpayers were being offered a predatory rate. So the Fed's loan to Chevron is for 4.5 years at 0.9%. Compare that to Wisconsin's loan with an interest rate of 1.28% over 3 years. So they have to pay it back at a shorter period of time with a higher interest rate. Kentucky actually got an even worse loan deal. For instance, 2% is the interest rate, and they must pay back that loan in 3 years. And when New York City needed a loan from the Federal Reserve, the Fed offered 1.9% that had to be paid back in 2 years. They later offered 1.6% over 36 months. But the point here is, oil companies, banks, massive corporations, they get these interest-free loans. They have all this time to pay it back. But when it comes to municipalities, when it comes to states, when it comes to the very people who desperately need these loans in order to prevent job losses, they get these higher interest rates and they have to pay back in a shorter period of time. So the Fed has only purchased 2 bonds in its municipal liquidity facility, lending just $1.6 billion of the $500 billion of lending capacity it has. Instead of lending at the rate that it lends to banks, with the interest rate currently at 0, the municipal liquidity facility has offered loans of at least 1% for terms of 24 to 36 months. So, you might think that 1% isn't that big of a deal, but it is if it's a giant loan. And especially if you have to pay that giant loan back in a shorter period of time, that becomes much more of a burden for the municipalities and the states that rely on these loans in order to make ends meet, especially now that Congress has become so useless in providing another round of stimulus.
Okay, so let's break this down. The Federal Reserve can give at apparently any rate they like because they're printing money, and oftentimes for the banks they have, and including right now, 0% interest rate. So they just give the money to the banks to loan out to make money off of. Now, if you were an approved bank, that's a good racket, okay? You know why? You're literally guaranteed money. It costs you nothing to get, and then you loan it out at a certain percentage. So there's almost no way of losing. Now, one of the excuses for that, and sometimes it's true, is look, I'm giving it to the banks for very little because they're facilitating it going to, for example, in the PPP to small businesses. And the government is not structured to find all those small businesses and to set up relationships with them right away. The banks are facilitating that, and for that, they're taking a little bit of a margin on the interest rate. Okay, I would put that on the sensible end of the spectrum, right? Okay, but if you're not in an emergency and you don't have to facilitate something like the PPP, then I'm still not sure why the banks get 0% interest. That makes no sense. By the way, if you don't know, the top Federal Reserve branch is in New York, and the New York Federal Reserve is run by the top banks in the country, which are in New York. So the Federal Reserve is run by the banks and gives the banks money at 0%. So when you look at it that way, it's actually not that surprising or confusing at all. What makes it confusing is the fact that the Federal Reserve can print basically public money and then use it for private interests. Well, that's deeply problematic and a giant problem we have to fix later. But now, when we come to this issue, I want to finish the analysis for you guys. They're then saying, okay, but we're gonna lend it to the banks at 0, not to facilitate something that the government, a bill that the government passed, but to give it to people in situations where they make a profit. But also now the Federal Reserve is just gonna give it straight to corporations. So they're giving to Chevron. Wait, then the banks aren't a middleman. Nobody's facilitating anything. Why is Chevron getting a better rate the municipalities, which is government to government, arguably government to government. It's all the US government anyway. It's just the federal and the state, and sometimes the cities, should be at a lower rate than you give to private corporations. There's no excuse at all. There's no facilitating or anything. They're like, nah, yeah, but the government's owned by the big corporations. They give campaign contributions to the politicians and bribe them. So that's why we give them money for free. But if you're in a city or state government and the people that are affected are government workers like, cops and fire department and other teachers. No, we don't care at all. And we're gonna charge you a higher rate. And the higher rate ranges from, at the low end, 1.28%, as Anna told you, all the way up to 2%. And now that might seem like small numbers, but it winds up being hundreds of billions of dollars in interest alone that the cities and states have to pay back to the federal government that Chevron doesn't have to. That's insane.
No, it's absolutely insane. And states they're in such an awful position right now because Congress, again, I'm gonna keep repeating this, has failed to provide any type of economic relief. And as a result, many of these public workers have either already been laid off or their jobs are imminently at risk. They're imminently at risk of losing their jobs. And so it's so disgusting to see this activity happen time and time again. And I don't know, Cenk, it almost appears as though these free market capitalists aren't really a fan of the free market, because in a free market you don't have the Federal Reserve show up and be like, hey, yo, we're printing cash, interest free, while giving a middle finger to states and municipalities and all of the government workers who need these loans in order to remain employed as Congress fails to provide stimulus. I also want to just give you some specific details on how much money they could save on interest payments if the Federal Reserve were lending to states the same way they're lending to banks and corporations. So proponents say that if you do away with the interest rate for states, that would allow municipalities to avoid mass layoffs and also save $160 billion in annual interest payments they pay Wall Street firms on their past debt. According to a report from Action Center on Race and the Economy, that amount is enough to help 13 million families avoid eviction by covering their annual rent, or enough to provide all 31.5 million unemployed workers $600 a week in pandemic unemployment assistance for 8 weeks. Because remember, guys, yes, the federal government stepped in temporarily and provided a more robust unemployment insurance program, an additional $600 a week to individuals who have been unemployed as a result of the pandemic. But remember that states run their own unemployment programs and they need funding for that as well. States are in a real bad spot right now, and it's not just Democratic states. I know that's what the Trump administration would have you believe, but funny enough, the state of Florida reached out to the Trump administration. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, reached out to the Trump administration, was like, we need some state funding, we're in a lot of trouble. So this is negatively impacting Americans across the country. It's a failure of our federal government, certainly a failure of how the Federal Reserve arbitrarily decides to lend at interest-free loans for the powerful while screwing over states and municipalities, and also a failure of Congress because they haven't been able to pass the stimulus that average Americans need and states and municipalities need as well.
So funny enough, it turns out Republicans are in favor of defunding the police because remember, that's $160 billion a year that you're taking out of local governments. And one of the things that local governments fund are the police. And so you're taking that out and giving it back to the Federal Reserve, but Chevron doesn't have to, and other corporations don't have to. They pay a much smaller rate, which means they save collectively hundreds of billions of dollars. And Anna pointed out, that's not free market capitalism at all. Look, we're consistent on this. We think that the government needs to step in, not every time, only when it's necessary. Right? It depends on the size of the job and what the job is. So I'm very much in favor of the PPP that went to small businesses, and it was a startlingly successful program, not because it kept small businesses in business, but because it was structured right to make sure they kept all their employees. So I'm in favor of that government program. I'm not in favor of government programs that just give away our money to the biggest corporations in the world. We're not reflexively pro-government, and it's in a more interesting dynamic than are you in favor of government or are you in favor of the markets? The answer is both, and it depends on the situation. But for right-wingers, they say no. Only the market. The government is not your friend. The government's terrible at everything except the cops, the fire department, the military, and all the other things that we love and helping Israel. Okay, but they're awful at everything else, and I don't want to give them a dime. And so I just believe in the free market. Well, what part of this is the free market? If you're a right winger, you should be more upset than the left wingers. Or you have no ideology at all, and you never believed anything that you said. The government just giving out tons of free cash to corporations is the least free market thing you could possibly do. And by the way, all this critique does not come from a progressive activist. It comes from a Federal Reserve commissioner. He's the one that brought out all this. He's the one that brought out the Chevron example and said, look, we're doing this, and I don't know why we're doing this. If you think it doesn't make sense, you're right, it doesn't make sense. And finally, the chicanery there that they do is, hey, we gave the Federal Reserve $500 billion that they could lend out to the real businesses in America. The multinational corporations we already took care of, the banks we already took care of, but this is for real businesses. $500 billion that they can give out in loans at low interest rates. But we only use 1.6 billion of it because we don't really care. We don't really want to help businesses. We want to only help the big businesses that bribe all of the politicians. So just be honest about it. That's exactly what's going on here. And among the reasons, unfortunately, to our great, great disappointment, America has become one of the most corrupt countries on earth because we legalize bribery.